Listen to the surf. We're in Polynesia, where same-sex love wasn't a rumor, it was part of life. Chiefs kept close male companions. Lovers found each other and lived it long before outsiders arrived with new rules and new shame. Missionaries wrote sin. Courts wrote crime. But the old words never fully died. They stayed at the edges, on the lips of aunties in costumes, in stories told after dark. This isn't a side note. It's a heartbeat. Same-sex love and gender-diverse lives ran through these islands like a current sometimes celebrated, sometimes pushed under, but still there. Tell me the exact time you're listening, sunrise paddle or midnight tide. If this straight-to-the-point history hits home tap like so the story reaches farther. They say every ocean remembers the first secret it ever carried. For Polynesia, that secret wasn't gold or conquest, it was companionship. Not the sword-clanging kind that Europe later celebrated, but the quiet, enduring kind that can fit inside a single canoe crossing, endless water. You imagine it now, stars sharp as pins above paddles dipping in rhythm, and two voyagers glancing at each other in that long hush between waves. Nobody calls it romance. Nobody needs to. In a world where survival depends on trust, affection grows like salt crust, inevitable. Before the word Polynesia even existed, these voyagers had already woven a triangle of migration from Taiwan down through Samoa, Tonga, Tahiti, and as far east as Rapa Nui. They carried fire breadfruit and a layered sense of kinship that blurred the lines between family mentorship and something softer. Same-sex bonds didn't need explaining because they weren't filed under scandal. They simply fit into the pattern of obligation, respect, and emotional fluency that island life demanded. Imagine how long you'd have to know someone to cross an ocean with them in a canoe smaller than a city bus. Days stretch into weeks, your whole horizon a moving circle of blue. Every paddle stroke is teamwork. Every storm tests intimacy more than muscle. When you share everything, food, sleep, steering, fear, love becomes a spectrum rather than a label. Anthropologists later tried to name that closeness. Polynesians never had to. Across islands, songs tell the same story in different rhythms. In Samoa, a chant might describe two young men whose devotion outlasted war. In Tahiti, a legend of twin spirits binding winds together. In Hawaii, a chant for warriors who slept side by side and rose as one. European translators often softened the language, turning beloved companion into close friend, but you can still feel the heartbeat underneath. You can almost hear the embarrassed cough of the first missionary who realized the poem he'd been copying wasn't about fishing. Same-sex affection wasn't a rebellion. It was woven into the architecture of respect. A chief might keep a favored attendant, not just for service, but for comfort, the way Greek nobles once had beloved youths. Though Polynesia didn't share the same hierarchy of shame. What mattered was balanced reciprocity between protector and companion giver and listener. The sea punished arrogance and social life punished greed. Love that kept both sides strong was practical, not political. Of course, modern listeners want categories. Were they gay, bisexual, fluid? The answer is both simpler and more complicated, yes, and also irrelevant. These societies defined people by what they contributed, not by whom they desired. A canoe needed paddlers, a village needed dancers, healers, teachers. Identity was function first, confession second. There's something freeing in that thought, isn't there? Imagine a community where nobody asks for explanations, where affection is observed, smiled at, and folded back into everyday rhythm. No declarations, no scandals, No coming out speeches beneath fluorescent lights. Just life continuing the same as the tide. And yet not everything was idyllic. Jealousies formed, politics intruded, and human hearts remained stubbornly human. Some stories tell of rival companions whose affection provoked quarrels within clans. But those dramas unfolded as social puzzles, not moral crimes. There was no sin assigned to love itself, only to the discord it might stir if handled poorly. You picture a beach at dusk, fishermen repairing nets, children racing along the waterline, two figures sharing roasted breadfruit near the fire. Their shoulders lean together naturally, like palm trunks in wind. No one gawks, no one whispers. In these moments, intimacy exists without needing translation. Even the gods mirrored this fluidity. Polynesian cosmology is full of partnerships that ignore human categories. Sky fathers nursing earth mothers, twin spirits swapping forms, and tricksters teaching mortals that gender is a costume, not a cage. But that part of the story can wait. For now, you stay here by the fire listening to the surf stitch its endless seam along the sand and realize something simple before outsiders named it love or sin. The ocean had already named it ordinary. By morning, the tide has already erased last night's footprints. But the words people used for themselves never really washed away. Every island, every dialect, every lagoon hid a vocabulary that Europeans couldn't quite translate. You hear the first one whispered like a lullaby in Hawaii Mahu. It means more than man or woman, something between beside and beyond. In village memory, Mahu were caretakers of songs and children keepers of healing chants, people who reminded everyone that balance was a living thing, not a rulebook. Missionaries later described them in nervous ink-writing phrases like effeminate men or hermaphrodites. The Polynesians just shrugged. Why make categories smaller than the ocean? A Mahu could teach dance. One day paddle a canoe, the next serve in ceremonies where gender lines twisted like palm fiber. They weren't outcasts. They were connective tissue. Sail south and the names change shape. In Samoa, they say fa'afafine, literally in the manner of a woman. But that's only the doorway into a much larger house. A fa'afafine might help raise siblings, run the household, or perform the graceful teasing dances that define Samoan celebration. Every family seemed to have someone born male, but raised in a feminine role, neither mocked nor sainted, simply necessary. Here's a thought. What if modern society didn't invent gender diversity, but merely forgot it? Every culture that reached a certain size learned the same truth. Polynesia never misplaced that identity is a toolkit, not a prison. You used what fit the day's work. Keep moving east to Tonga, and you'll meet the whakalady like a lady. Same melody, different rhythm. They appear in old court records as attendants at royal feasts, gifted at song and costume. Even European visitors, usually quick to frown, admitted the laity were charming hosts. Today, many still organize beauty pageants and community aid groups. History, it seems, found its sparkle again. These names, Mahu, Fa'afafine, Whakaleti, aren't synonyms. They're coordinates on a shared map of flexibility. Each arose from a practical logic. In island societies where work was communal, where labor divided by need rather than anatomy, a body that could shift roles was valuable. If you could fish, and so climb and cradle build and soothe, you weren't confusing the social order, you were keeping it afloat. European sailors didn't know what to do with this. In their journals, they described such individuals as odd, graceful, deceptive, sometimes all three in one sentence. They couldn't decide whether to be scandalized or impressed. You imagine one of them trying to explain it to a superior. Back home, sir, There are men who act like women, yet are respected, even adored. The superior probably spilled his tea. But Polynesians, pragmatic as always, had bigger worries, like whether the next storm would flatten the breadfruit grove. In their worldview, a person's mana, their spiritual power, was measured by harmony, not conformity. If you lived honestly and contributed, you were in tune. If you lied or disrupted, you weren't. The rest was detail. You might ask, how did families react? Most accounts suggest with an easy acceptance that would shock modern pundits. Parents often encouraged a child's natural inclinations, especially if a son showed interest in caregiving or dance. They believed that gifts chose the person, not the other way around. When travelers arrived asking who was male or female, villagers simply pointed to who did which job, smiled politely, and changed the subject. There's a lovely old Hawaiian saying, "He aliika aina." He kawa ke kanaka. The land is chief, the people are its servants. In that hierarchy, nature outranked gender. If the mountain could wear cloud one day and sunlight the next, why shouldn't a person's spirit shift too? Of course, some modern ears twitch when hearing these stories. They want clear edges, definitions that fit on paper. But island life isn't built on edges, it's built on tides. Everything moves, categories blur. Maybe that's why these words survived colonial erasure. They were never frozen in dictionaries, only sung in kitchens and whispered to children at dusk. When you say mahu, you're not labeling someone. You're describing a way of being at peace between forces. When you say fa'afafin, you're naming an act of generosity, a bridge between brothers and sisters. When you say fakaleti, you're smiling at someone who made space sparkle where it might have gone dull. Even now on islands, threaded with Wi-Fi and neon, those words still hold the same warmth. They remind everyone that identity didn't arrive on foreign ships, it was already dancing on the shore. The ocean has its own library, and the myths are its oldest books. Some whisper of gods who change shape to teach mortals humility, others of lovers whose gender shifts with the tide. You hear one in the voice of a Hawaiian storyteller who begins with a grin. Once before the missionaries learned to blush, that's your cue to lean closer. Polynesian mythology is not shy about transformation. In Samoa, there's Nafanua, the war goddess, who walked the earth disguised as a man until her armor fell away in battle, revealing her female form and stunning those who thought only men could win wars. In Tonga, Maui isn't just the cheerful trickster Disney trimmed into a sidekick. He's a shapeshifter whose tricks include switching gender to outwit gods, a reminder that cleverness ignores anatomy. And across Hawaii's lava fields, the demigod Kaneapua is said to have had relationships that modern tongues would call same-sex, but ancient priests simply called pono balance. One story lingers in Tahitian memory, two heroes, Tafai and Ta'aroa, sharing a union so loyal that even gods envied it. Some colonial translators labeled their affection brotherhood, but the original chant, if you listen to its rhythm, sounds more like courtship than fraternity heartbeats, translated into drumming syllables. You wonder how many truths drowned in translation, because someone decided love must always wear opposite shoes. Even the creation myths resist simple pairing. In some versions, the first being divided itself into male and female halves, not to separate forever, but to play both sides of harmony, like waves needing troughs as much as crests. The old priests taught that the world began with duality, entwined, not divided. If the universe itself contained both, why would human hearts pretend otherwise? Here's a question worth asking. when did the idea of forbidden begin? It wasn't born under palm trees. In the oral tradition, intimacy was part of cosmic order, not a rebellion against it. The gods danced, loved, and laughed across gender lines long before anyone arrived with Latin grammar and guilt. You imagine an ancient night ceremony, torches, crackled drums, pulse like slow thunder, and dancers move in a blur of hips and hands. Among them are Mahu, half-spirit, half-bridge, gliding between men's and women's steps without hesitation. The spectators don't gasp. They cheer. To dance both sides of creation is not an act of defiance, but of blessing. When Captain Cook's crew landed in Tahiti in the 1770s, they wrote startled notes about men dressed as women, delicate in gesture. But they also recorded something else, how the locals treated these individuals not as curiosities, but as beloved entertainers and healers. They are esteemed, one journal said reluctantly, for their talents. Esteemed and paid in fish mats and affection. You wonder if any sailor realized he was witnessing a world where gender wasn't a fence, but a field. Across the islands, oral stories kept those fluid spirits alive, even as colonial ink tried to drown them. The gods became metaphors when they had to myth as camouflage. But inside those metaphors were instructions how to live without shame, how to move like water when the shape of love changes. Think of Hina, the moon goddess, who watches over tides and lovers alike. In one version of her tale, she falls for another goddess, and their nightly embrace causes the tides to rise. In another, she becomes a man's wife, only to return to the sky because his love couldn't contain hers. Either way, she ends where she began, in motion, self-possessed whole. Compare that to the imported legends that would later arrive, stories of sin, punishment, and the fall. The Polynesian universe didn't have a fall. It had a rhythm, rise, ebb, return. Even the language reflects it. Words for love. Aroha, alofa, ofa, all share the same root sound across the ocean, meaning care that flows outward. They were used for family, friends, lovers, gods. Nobody needed subcategories like romantic or platonic. Affection was measured by sincerity, not anatomy. You can almost see it now, storytellers sitting by firelight weaving these myths while kids drowse and elders hum approval. No one argues whether the hero is really male or female, whether the god's love is acceptable. The story ends, the stars come out, and the sea continues breathing, as if to say, of course it happened this way. Look how the tide loves the shore, endlessly coming back. Sometimes the most radical truths don't arrive with a shout, they stroll in during dinner. Here's your hook. In Polynesian villages, same-sex affection often lived right beside the stew pot. No symbols, no slogans, just ordinary evenings where tenderness hid in the open because nobody bothered to outlaw it. Picture the daily rhythm, dawn nets hauled from the lagoon, laughter over slippery fish children darting through palm shade. By dusk, torches bloom, smoke curls from earth ovens, and the talk softens. Companionship stretches itself out across mats woven from pandanus leaves. A hand brushes a shoulder. Someone sings half a love song before switching to a joke, and the village hum keeps rolling. If you're waiting for scandal, you'll be waiting past midnight. Anthropologists centuries later would puzzle over this ease. They'd ask villagers, "Who are the couples here?" and get shrugs in reply. It wasn't that people lied. It was that the question didn't make sense. Affection came in too many sizes to catalog. A man might share sleeping space with another man during long voyages or fishing seasons. Was that friendship, love? The islanders would say, both. In Samoa, travelers noted how fa'afafine moved through households like sunlight, helping with chores, teasing the men, caring for the young, all while keeping a current of playful affection that confused the Europeans to no end. One missionary complained, "There is too much laughter among them." That line alone explains everything. Joy was the crime. You see it again in Tahiti, where dance was social grammar. The movements told jokes, proposals, and sometimes very clear invitations. Male dancers often paired off with one another in festivals, their gestures mimicking courtship, but also celebrating skill. To the audience, it wasn't inappropriate. It was talent wrapped in rhythm. If two performers grew closer afterward, the community considered it none of their business. Even work carried traces of this intimacy. Men carved canoes together for weeks in forest clearings, living off roasted taro and gossip. Shared labor meant shared trust, and shared trust often blurred into affection. In small societies where survival demanded cooperation, warmth wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged. Who wants to fish beside someone they secretly despise? Of course not. Every bond was romantic. But the line between affection and attraction was soft, like the tide line that shifts each morning. The islands taught that emotion could flow freely without threatening order. That's a lesson modern workplaces could use. Imagine if your office respected teamwork with half the sincerity of a canoe crew. Every now and then, European visitors tried to classify what they saw. Captain Cook's naturalist, Joseph Banks, scribbled about men of gentle manners who appear fond of their own sex. He sounded bewildered, but not disgusted. Later, visitors weren't so generous. They came armed with Victorian morality and the vocabulary of scandal. But their shock says more about their upbringing than about Polynesia. Here's a modern mirror. Think of a neighborhood barbecue where everyone knows each other's quirks, the aunt who always oversalts the uncle who hums off key. Now imagine in that same crowd a pair who simply prefer each other's company year after year. That was the village dynamic. Familiarity protects what outsiders might judge. Music helped too. Love songs didn't specify gender because pronouns were fluid in many island languages. A verse might address beloved without declaring whether that beloved wore flowers or feathers. You could sing it to anyone, and everyone would hum along. That linguistic neutrality functioned like camouflage and celebration at once. A French sailor once wrote of a night feast in the Marquesas, where he noticed two youths lying close, whispering in the dark. He meant it as curiosity. The locals barely noticed. One elder even teased him, "You stare like someone who's never had a friend." You can feel the cultural gap yawning there, the difference between suspicion and acceptance. Domestic scenes carried the same gentle elasticity. In many households, a mahu or fa'afafine helped mediate disputes, prepare children for ceremonies, or care for aging parents. Love and duty intertwined until separating them felt absurd. To Polynesian eyes, affection wasn't a private identity. It was social glue. Even language of insult gave away its rarity. There were words for laziness, greed, betrayal, but almost none for consensual same-sex relations. What's unnamed can't be systematically hated. And when the first missionaries came searching for sin, the translators had to invent one. Imagine standing in that twilight waves, murmuring torches spitting salt into the air, watching two people sit close after a long day of labor. There's no speech about rights, no guilt-soaked metaphors, just proximity that feels earned. You start to realize why early Polynesian societies didn't need to debate love. They practiced it quietly between chores. not every mat in the village was woven equal. Step behind the curtain of rank and affection, starts wearing new costumes, some stitched with power, others with danger. Among chiefs, relationships weren't just personal. They were political assets, delicate threads that could bind clans or unravel them overnight. And sometimes those threads were spun from intimacy itself. You picture a high-ranking Ali in Hawaii, skin-oiled hair, bound tattoos coiled like rope around his arm, surrounded by attendants. One might fan him, another polish the laid Niho Palaoa pendant on his chest, and one particular companion might linger a little longer when the others leave. No one whispers. Everyone knows. Among chiefs, affection wasn't a scandal unless it broke alliance rules. In societies built on reciprocity, closeness to a leader was both privilege and peril. To be favored meant access to fine mats, better food, and prestige. But it also meant walking a line so thin it could cut. The favorite might be a warrior, a poet, or a healer. Someone who steadied the chief's moods, tended his wounds, and sometimes shared his bed. The bond could blur duty and desire, until neither could be untangled. Polynesian history has hints of these pairings. In Tahitian courts, records mention Ra'atira nobles, who kept male attendants noted for beauty and wit. Some served as performers in private banquets, blending entertainment and companionship. European visitors misread these roles through their own moral lenses, calling them effeminate courtiers, missing the point entirely. They were mirrors to their chiefs, trusted enough to hold power close without threatening it. In Samoa, oral traditions speak of noblemen gifting fine mats or shells to companions who shared their voyages or victories. These weren't transactional flings. They were relationships of fa'aloalo, deep respect. When one such bond soured, songs were composed not as gossip, but as elegies, lamenting the loss of harmony. In Polynesian logic, heartbreak wasn't embarrassing. It was art material. And yet privilege had blind spots. For commoners, similar attachments sometimes earned side eyes or cautionary whispers. Hierarchy dictated how much affection the community could safely witness. Chiefs could afford eccentricities, fishermen could not. Still, island tolerance ran deeper than law. You might get teased, not punished. Laughter, not exile. It was an ecosystem of subtle permissions. Women's roles in this world were equally fluid, but differently documented. High-ranking women often kept female companions, who were both confidants and collaborators in ceremony. Early missionaries recorded such closeness with alarm, calling them unnatural friendships. But local records hint otherwise. Shared tattoos, joint offerings at temples, and poetic exchanges suggest bonds more intimate than politics. Their affection, like most things Polynesian, was public, yet invisible to outsiders. Power shaped privacy. In the great stone compounds of Tonga's royalty guards, turned away curious eyes, while feasts and dances blurred into the night. Within those walls, rules could loosen, laughter could spill, where sermons would later thunder. You realize hierarchy was not hypocrisy, it was strategy. The chiefs understood something missionaries didn't. Controlling pleasure was impossible, but containing its rumor was good governance. Imagine being one of those attendants trusted with secrets, aware that proximity to authority made your existence both enviable and precarious. The same hands that poured the chief's drink could sign your exile if gossip spread too far. Loyalty was currency, discretion armor. In that light, same-sex relationships in high circles weren't rebellion. They were diplomacy performed on the body. Even centuries later, traces survive in chants and genealogies. Certain songs speak of two chiefs sleeping head to foot, a polite euphemism repeated so often, it stopped needing explanation. Others tell of warriors bound by oaths of brotherhood so intense they outlived marriage. Anthropologists still argue over how literal those phrases were, but language this consistent doesn't spring from imagination alone. If you squint, you can see a proto-politics of privacy forming long before Western law arrived. Love adapted to hierarchy. Intimacy learned the art of camouflage. That's why Polynesian history isn't a straight line of acceptance or oppression. It's a braid, faith, power, affection, secrecy. Pull one strand and the whole thing hums. Here's an irony worth savoring. European nobles from Shakespeare's pages to the halls of Versailles also practiced affectionate mentorships and same-sex liaisons, yet condemned the islanders for similar habits. Maybe what unsettled them wasn't the act, it was the ease. The Polynesians hadn't buried desire in metaphor. They'd just let it share the room. You can almost hear the rustle of pandanus mats in those private chambers. The laughter muted, but not ashamed. The rhythm of palm fronds swaying outside like a steady drumbeat, reminding everyone that secrecy, too, is part of survival. The drumbeat changes when strangers arrive, carrying Bibles instead of sails. You've seen this movie before. The opening shot always glows like paradise, the ending flickers with ash. In the early 19th century, Polynesia's calm acceptance of human variety collided with imported guilt so loud it could drown out surf. Missionaries stepped ashore with starch in their collars and a singular purpose to rewrite heaven's guest list. They looked at Mahu Fa'afafine Fakaleti and saw not healers or teachers, but fallen men. They took the warmth of the village hearth and replaced it with a wooden pulpit. Suddenly, affection needed explaining. It took less than a generation for laughter, once shared in public, to retreat behind doors. The new gospel came with clothing requirements, literally. Men told to wear trousers, women told to cover shoulders, everyone told to confess desire only in one direction. European modesty arrived like mildew, growing fastest where air once flowed free. The first converts were often chiefs seeking trade advantages. With baptism came muskets and mirrors, a new currency of respectability. But the missionaries demanded moral theater to go with it. Purity, civilization, Christian family. The side effect, an entire emotional vocabulary outlawed overnight. Mahu were ordered to cut hair short, Fa'afafine told to act proper. Some complied for safety. Others quietly refused, keeping old ways alive in kitchens and festivals long after the mission bells slept. Colonial administrations followed religion's scent. Laws sprouted like invasive vines. British sodomy acts in Fiji. French decency codes in Tahiti, American statutes in Hawaii. None of these ideas were native. The Polynesian word for sin, hara, used to mean imbalance, a disturbance of harmony. Now it was redefined to include affection itself. Imagine being told that the same gestures once blessed by priests now condemned your soul. Mission records from Tahiti read like moral surveillance. 2 youths found sharing a mat. A woman overly familiar with her companion. Each entry dripping with disapproval, yet strangely fascinated. It's the same paradox everywhere. The colonizer cannot stop staring at what he calls obscene. There's a haunting story from Hawaii in the 1850s, a revered Mahu healer named Kapa Mahu, whose legend had stretched back generations, suddenly rewritten as hermaphrodite sorcerer. The 4 stones dedicated to them on Waikiki Beach, once respected as the guardians of health, were nearly erased from record, their meaning sanitized to fit Sunday sermons. It took until the 21st century for local historians to restore their names. Imagine centuries of silence pressed into a single monument of lava rock. You might wonder how ordinary people coped. The answer is equal parts sadness and ingenuity. Villagers learned to split lives into halves, public obedience, private truth. Songs grew clever verses written in code, where moonlight fishing meant secret meetings and two paddles on one side meant companionship not blessed by the church. Humor became armor, satire confession. By the late 1800s, the word civilized had become a leash. Men were jailed under imported sodomy laws. Women who lived together were called suspicious. And yet behind the strict facades, everyone knew the stories. Chiefs still had attendants. Sailors still traded affection under stars. Even some missionaries, lonely after years abroad, found themselves comforted by the very company they condemned. Hypocrisy, like coconuts, traveled well. If you listen closely, you can hear the sound of something else rising beneath repression's stubborn endurance. Fa'afafine communities in Samoa formed whisper networks, shared housing, shared labor, quiet mutual defense. They carried culture through service, caring for elders, organizing festivals, teaching dance. They became indispensable again, surviving by being useful. Colonizers could write laws, but they couldn't outlaw competence. When photography arrived early, images tried to flatten complexity. Studio portraits from the 1890s show islanders posed stiffly dressed in borrowed Victorian clothes, expressionless under a hot flashbulb. Yet in the corners of those photos, just beyond the frame, life went on unchanged. Laughter at the communal oven. A hand resting a moment too long on another's shoulder. There's bitter humor in how Westerners sold postcards of exotic island beauties while preaching chastity in the same breath. The same gaze that punished love also profited from it. Tourism long before Jet Age was already voyeurism dressed as discovery. If you trace the coastline of any island today, you'll still find both footprints, the missionary's boot and the mahu's bare heel. The tension between them shaped a century. The Polynesians learned to nod politely at sermons while keeping old understanding tucked inside lullabies. That quiet defiance, the art of smiling through suppression, is its own kind of navigation. And maybe when the last hymn fades and the surf returns, you realize the story never truly left the shore. It just learned to whisper until the wind was safe again. The law may have silenced mouths, but it couldn't police heartbeats. When the colonizers wrote morality into ink, Polynesians replied with subtext, humor, and endurance. It wasn't rebellion with banners, it was survival in song and rumor. In the small, clever ways, ordinary people reclaimed their humanity. By the early 20th century, the region's prisons were quietly filling with moral offenders. But the records don't read like crimes. They read like misunderstandings of intimacy. 2 sailors caught under the pier, a house servant sharing quarters with another of his sex. The punishments were short, the shame longer. Yet even in the court transcripts, you can sense the island shrug beneath the imported outrage. Judges, often locals trained under colonial codes, handed out fines with eyes that said, "This is ridiculous, but the paper must be satisfied." On plantations in Tahiti and sugar fields in Fiji, same-sex bonds reappeared where laborers slept shoulder to shoulder after 14-hour days. When men are far from families, loneliness invents its own grammar. European overseers called it vice. The workers called it companionship. Some songs from that era survive in fragments full of double meanings. Praise for a friend's strength that sounds suspiciously like longing. The tune pretends innocence, but the rhythm confesses everything. War brought new contradictions. During World War II, American and Allied bases sprawled across Samoa, Tonga, Hawaii, Tahiti. Uniforms marched in curfews followed, and for the first time local men and women saw Hollywood's version of masculinity, a loud, squared-shouldered ideal that looked nothing like their own. The Fa'afafine and Mahu found themselves both admired and mocked by foreign troops, admired for their humor, scorned for their openness. Some soldiers sought them out in secret, others jeered by day and returned by night. The islands learned to navigate hypocrisy as smoothly as they once navigated reefs. It wasn't only men. Women who loved women, rarely written about but always present, found private havens in weaving circles, church choirs, and small businesses. They swapped letters wrapped in flower garlands, met during Sunday preparations, and spoke in codes about borrowing thread. When you hear an elder laugh about how many sarongs one could mend in a week, you start catching the joke. Colonial policing did its best to catch up. In 1920s, Honolulu arrests for lewd conduct rose sharply, mostly aimed at native Hawaiians in hotel districts. But the punishment was temporary. The community ties were not. The Mahu adapted by taking nightlife underground. Luau shows at private homes became refuge disguised as entertainment. Imagine torchlight ukuleles, the smell of roasted pork, and a performer stepping forward in silk hair, cascading, voice steady. Guests laugh, clap dance. Beneath the joy is something sharper, defiance wrapped in charm. By mid-century, the trick was camouflage. Publicly, you followed colonial decorum. Privately, you redefined family. Two friends renting a house together, cousins, of course. A fa'afafine raising a relative's children, merely helping out. Love wore the mask of duty and thrived behind it. You could be invisible to outsiders and indispensable to your own. There's a file from 1936 Samoa about a supposed scandal involving a high chief's son and his fa'afafine companion. The missionary press demanded punishment. The chief replied coolly, "My son's heart chooses what keeps it strong." The governor fined no one. The report ends with bureaucratic frustration and a note native customs remain difficult to reform. Translation affection keeps winning. Even the prisons turned into accidental laboratories of tolerance. Guards discovered that separating offenders only made them harder to manage. Eventually, they stopped caring as long as work got done. The system's apathy became an unlikely ally. And then came travel ships, telegrams, gossip. News spread between islands faster than sermons could chase it. Polynesians began hearing of global movements. Harlem artists breaking taboos. Paris cabarets celebrating drag soldiers in Europe, forming bonds that defied rules. It confirmed what the islands already knew. Love doesn't vanish. It migrates. Through it all, humor remained a shield sharper than any spear. One Samoan proverb captures it perfectly. A legata I le upega, e tau tau I le ia I o le upega, e tau tau I le tagata. It is not only the net that catches fish, but also the net that catches people. The proverb, half warning, half wink, reminds you that connection itself can ensnare or save. In these years, it did both. You imagine a quiet beach after curfew moonlight, on wet sand, two silhouettes leaning shoulder to shoulder, whispering about tomorrow's shift or tomorrow's ship. Somewhere a soldier's radio hums an American love song. The words don't fit the moment, but the melody does. Law can dictate conduct, but it can't choreograph hearts. Polynesians understood that, long before the ink dried on colonial statutes. Their resistance wasn't loud. It was rhythmic, like waves undoing footprints after every tide. When the ships of empire finally sailed off for good, they left something strange behind a pile of notebooks, a camera on a tripod, and a new kind of voyeur. The anthropologist replaced the missionary, and the lens replaced the pulpit. The islands were no longer being converted, they were being documented. Early anthropologists came chasing the untouched native, but they arrived a century too late. Cultures already tangled with colonial threads and gender diversity had learned to hide in plain sight. So the scholars found fragments, half-whispered words, gestures quickly retracted, and tried to build theories out of gossip. Their books filled Western shelves with a peculiar blend of fascination and distortion. The effeminate males of the South Seas, Polynesian inversion, primitive homosexuality. They cataloged what islanders simply lived. In Samoa, Margaret Mead's Coming of Age, in Samoa 1928, became a bestseller in America. Readers devoured her tales of carefree adolescence. But they missed what she only hinted at, the fa'afafine she met, but dared not describe in detail, for fear of scandal. Mead saw fluidity everywhere, yet wrapped it in anthropology's polite vagueness. The truth was too human for her publisher's comfort. A few decades later, cameras arrived. National Geographic filmed Polynesian dancers with wide smiles and narrow understanding. Western audiences gasped at the colors, the movements, the ease of bodies unashamed. They labeled it exotic. What they didn't realize was that some of the most graceful performers, the ones who seemed to blur masculine and feminine, were mahu and fakaleti, reclaiming visibility on their own terms. You might say they turned anthropology into theater. Think of it this way: while Europeans dissected identity with theories, Polynesians choreographed theirs with rhythm. Film crews aimed to capture authentic culture, and the locals obliged with satire. In Tonga, performers inserted subtle jokes about foreign scholars into dances, mocking the observers while smiling for the camera. It was a master class in polite rebellion. There's a story from the 1960s about an American sociologist who interviewed Fa'afafine Inapia. He asked, "When did you first feel different?" One of them, tired of the question, replied, "When you asked it." That line still circulates in local humor, a reminder that identity isn't pathology, it's perspective. Anthropology's notebooks couldn't contain real life. In private, the communities kept flourishing. Fa'afafine organized talent shows that doubled as fundraisers for hospitals. Mahu in Hawaii began leading hula revivals, preserving chants missionaries had tried to erase. Their bodies became living archives, every movement a footnote correcting a century of misunderstanding. Meanwhile, tourism boomed. Jet planes replaced steamships, and glossy brochures sold the islands as paradise. Ironically, the same exotic charm used to attract visitors depended on performers who embodied gender fluidity, the very people colonial law once condemned. Waikiki's early drag reviews in the 1950s weren't just entertainment. They were survival disguised as spectacle. Tourists applauded, unaware they were witnessing cultural resistance in sequence. Some anthropologists eventually caught on. By the 1970s, new researchers, Polynesian themselves, started rewriting the record. They interviewed elders in their own languages, translating nuance rather than scandal. Names like Nico Besnier in Tonga or John O'Malicia in Samoa began restoring dignity to what Westerners had pathologized. The term third gender, once a clinical curiosity, became a bridge word instead of a cage. Still, the Western gaze had left scars. You see it in the way locals learned to self-edit around outsiders, hesitating before a joke, glancing before holding hands. Public warmth became stage-managed. The camera wanted a smile, not a story. and yet Polynesian humor endured. When a tourist once asked a Samoan elder, "How many Fa'afafine live here?" he replied, "Enough to keep the island tidy." Simple, sharp, impossible to misinterpret. The laughter that followed wasn't mockery, it was reclaiming narrative power. These decades built a paradox. The very studies meant to freeze culture in time helped preserve evidence that fluidity always existed. The archives became accidental allies. Today's Fa'afafine activists quote those dusty reports to prove that their history predates colonization. The anthropologists who once exoticized them now serve posthumously as witnesses for the defense. It makes you wonder how many other cultures hid their truths in plain sight, until someone pointed a camera the wrong way, and how often did the subjects quietly direct the scene? In Polynesia, the answer seems obvious. When outsiders came to observe, the locals came to perform, but the performance belonged to them. You can almost hear the click of the old film reel, the whir of the projector, and then laughter spilling off screen. Somewhere a mahu leans in and whispers to a friend. They still don't get it, do they? By the time the 20th century rolled toward its neon years, Polynesia had learned to juggle masks and mirrors. The war was over. The tourists were coming, and the nightlife was humming with borrowed jazz and local drums. What missionaries once called sin became the island's best-selling export performance color confidence and a kind of freedom dressed in feathers. Honolulu was the first to shimmer. The 1950s and 60s saw mahu performers lighting up clubs along Kalakaua Avenue, dazzling servicemen on shore leave. Names like Hinale Moana Wongkalu trace their lineage to those pioneers dancers who risked arrest by day and stole applause by night. The audience saw sequins. Behind the sparkle was resilience polished by centuries of practice. Elsewhere, modern life was rewriting intimacy itself. Global migration scattered Polynesians across Auckland, Sydney, San Francisco. The Fa'afafine followed working in hospitals, factories, beauty salons, building diaspora communities where acceptance was a team sport. They formed associations, not just for solidarity, but for charity fundraisers, for orphanages, blood drives, scholarship programs. If colonial law once painted them as disorderly, their civic service painted the opposite. In Tonga, the Whakaleti turned community organizing into an art. They planned beauty pageants that doubled as social hubs, parades of humor and pride beneath strings of fairy lights. Outsiders saw glamour, insiders saw survival. Each crown awarded was another small rebellion against erasure. Some events quietly collected donations for families ostracized by church authorities, transforming celebration into social work. Tourism complicated everything. On one hand, it opened doors. Hotels hired mahu and fa'afafine as entertainers, guides, cultural ambassadors. On the other, it sold paradise as a postcard stripped of its politics. Visitors snapped photos of smiling dancers without knowing those smiles were also defenses. Polynesians, ever strategic, used the industry's hunger for spectacle to keep tradition alive on their own terms. You could exile ritual from temples, but not from stages. Modernization brought another wave: television, radio, the slow hum of imported pop culture. For the first time, islanders heard words like homosexuality and transvestite used on air, and they didn't fit. The locals already had better vocabulary, warmer ones. Still, the global conversation mattered. In the 1970s and 80s, Pacific Voices began joining international LGBTQ networks, translating their identities for outsiders, who finally seemed willing to listen. But home remained complicated. In church halls, preachers borrowed American fundamentalist rhetoric, declaring old customs against nature. Sermons thundered louder. So did laughter in kitchens afterward. Faith, after all, was older than the missionaries Polynesians had worshipped the ocean before anyone named it sin. Many reconciled belief and identity by reframing, both God made the tides made us all different. End of discussion. Take Samoa in the 1980s. The Fa'afafine community launched talent nights that became local legends, comedy sketches mocking corrupt politicians, songs about heartbreak, both sincere and satirical. These shows raised funds for hospitals and schools, and no one dared condemn charity wrapped in humor. Even government ministers showed up applauding while pretending not to. The unspoken truce was simple. As long as laughter filled the hall, judgment stayed outside. In Hawaii, cultural revival brought the mahu back into daylight. The hula renaissance reclaimed dance as sacred storytelling, not tourist gimmickry. Leaders like Hinale Moana Kalu took the stage to remind audiences that gender diversity wasn't a modern import, it was the soil from which Hawaiian tradition grew. Each chant restored fragments of history buried under colonial sermons. When a mahu teaches hula today, you're not watching novelty, you're witnessing repatriation of knowledge. Urban life also birthed quieter revolutions. In New Zealand, Polynesian youth, Samoan, Tongan, Cook Islander, formed queer collectives, mixing reggae beats with ancestral poetry. In Tahiti, artists painted Raiere transgender women as muses, reversing centuries of caricature. Art galleries became temples for stories once confined to whispers. If you pause, you can almost smell the crosswinds of that era. Diesel fumes from buses, coconut oil from dancers' skin, the sweet metal of coins tossed into a performer's hand. The world had shrunk, but Polynesian identity had expanded, elastic, bilingual, proudly noisy. Of course, not everyone clapped. Laws lingered. Prejudice still dressed itself in Sunday whites. Yet each decade chipped away at the imported shame. The new generation grew up watching Fa'afafine MCs on TV, seeing Lady organizing charities, hearing Mahu teach language revival in schools. Representation stopped being novelty and became normal. There's irony here. Colonialism tried to erase fluid identity in the name of civilization. But globalization revived it through entertainment activism and diaspora networks. What once hid behind pandanus mats now broadcast from microphones. You picture a nightclub in Suva or Auckland, neon lights dripping over tattooed shoulders, bass lines shaking the floor. A Fakaleti steps to the mic, winks, and says, "My ancestors danced barefoot. I dance in heels." Progress, darling. The crowd roars not because it's shocking, but because it feels like home. That's Polynesia in the modern age, reclaiming what was never truly lost, turning old silence into choreography and finding new rhythms in the noise of global streets. The ocean still hums outside, patient as ever, reminding you that everything washed away eventually returns with the next tide. The ocean never forgets its own stories. It just waits for the next generation to listen without blushing. What began in canoes and chants has come full circle in courtrooms and pride parades, carried by descendants who refuse to apologize for existing in more than one form. You stand now in a Polynesia stitched together by fiber optics and memory. In Samoa, Fa'afafine leaders walk into government buildings not as curiosities, but as consultants. They draft gender policy briefs in the morning and host village fundraisers by night. Their wit is still sharper than any sermon. In Tonga, laity associations partner with churches for HIV awareness campaigns, preaching compassion where dogma once barked. In Hawaii, Mahu educators teach hula in public schools, explaining that every motion, every turn of the wrist, contains history that refused to die. The revival isn't loud in a Western sense, it's steady. Across the Pacific, activists are reframing identity not as rebellion, but as restoration. They speak of fa'aloalo, respect of aloha, aroha, alofa, love that doesn't require footnotes. Colonial laws are being repealed island by island. In 2019, Tonga's neighbors in Palau struck down their last sodomy clause. In 2023, Samoa's parliament debated legal recognition for fa'afafine. Progress moves like a tide slow, certain ungovernable. Diaspora communities amplify it. Auckland hosts annual Pacifica Pride festivals where flags of every island ripple beside rainbow banners. In Sydney, Polynesian drag queens reclaim ancestral tattoos and ancestral rhythms at once, hips rolling to drum beats older than any law. In Honolulu, Pride marches open with conch shells, the sound echoing across skyscrapers like a reminder that the land still belongs to the ocean first. What makes this movement distinct is its refusal to borrow shame from imported scripts. Western narratives often frame queerness as opposition. The Pacific frames it as continuity. You hear activists say, "We are not new, we are remembering." That single sentence might be the most decolonial statement of all. Still, the struggle isn't decorative. Church pressure persists, jobs disappear for those who stand too visibly in the surf of change, and elders sometimes look away out of habit. Yet even resistance is softening. One priest in American Samoa recently said during a sermon, "If God made the sea with many currents, who am I to forbid one from flowing home?" That line made its way across the islands in hours. Art keeps pace. Filmmakers in Tahiti shoot documentaries where Raiere narrate their own stories instead of being framed by outsiders. Poets in Hawaii write verses where English and Olelo Hawaii braid like twin vines. Hi'aina Kapilina, the land itself is relationship. Sculptors carve and painters paint, but always with that same theme, the body as archive, the ocean as memory. You can almost smell the contemporary Pacific night coconut oil and asphalt laughter from a street vendor, the faint thump of a club somewhere near the water. A group of fa'afafine walk past, chatting about politics and mascara with equal expertise. They nod at elders sitting on benches, and the elders nod back. That small gesture might be the quietest revolution on Earth. What's striking is how the modern world, for all its technology, still relies on the same ancient tools to heal storytelling rhythm and communal space. You find Mahu podcasts mixing oral tradition with pop music. TikToks filmed under banyan trees explaining pre-colonial myths to teenagers scrolling on lunch breaks. The medium changed. The message stayed sacred. Across these islands, scars left by colonization are fading into something else, calluses maybe. They remind but no longer hurt. The words that once survived only in whispers, Mahu fa'afafine fakaleti, are now printed on university syllabi, spoken at graduation podiums, hashtagged celebrated. The ancestors who danced in secret would probably laugh and say, "Took you long enough." So the ocean hums. The same refrain, identity isn't imported, it's tidal. Cultures can bend without breaking. Love in all its local dialects keeps its own calendar. And when tomorrow's historians ask how Polynesia rediscovered itself, the answer will be simple. It listened to the stories that never stopped talking, only waited for ears brave enough to hear. The drums quiet, lanterns bob over calm water. You breathe with the waves slow, and even the way voyagers once did while reading the stars. Every island sleeps under the same sky, carrying all its names. Chief dancer healer Fa'afafine Mahuleti, and 1,000 others, each one a different way. The human heart learned to belong. You've seen how Polynesian love could be fluid, sacred, and quietly defiant, but affection was only half the story. Beneath the calm lagoons and carved temples, desire took stranger shapes. Rituals of pleasure taboos turned upside down, and customs that made even sailors blush. Ready yourself, because now we dive into the most shocking sexual practices in Polynesia. You step onto warm sand as the air hums with drum beats and sea salt. Behind the horizon's calm, every gesture is a conversation, and every taboo a doorway half open. Desire here isn't lawless. It's organized, rehearsed, and quietly negotiated through a code older than any kingdom. You quickly realize that Polynesian intimacy was not about impulse. It was about rhythm. The first thing you learn is that love had rules, but those rules weren't written by priests or kings. They were drawn by tapu, the sacred system that governed everything, from fishing to flirting. Tapu wasn't just about what was forbidden. It was about what was powerful. You didn't avoid a person because they were dirty. You kept your distance because touching them might short-circuit the universe. The same system that said, "Don't touch that idol," could also whisper, "Don't touch that cousin." And yet, in the flicker of a torch, the line between sacred and tempting often blurred. Imagine a feast on one of the Society Islands. The chief sits under a thatched pavilion, surrounded by his kin, each placement decided by genealogy. A single misstep, sitting where your lineage doesn't allow, could spark scandal before dessert. But sometimes scandal was exactly the point. A woman might drop her garland into someone's lap, not by accident, but by invitation. If he picked it up and tucked it behind his ear, it meant yes. If he ignored it, well, there'd be gossip at the lagoon tomorrow. The Polynesians didn't invent subtlety. They perfected it. In Tahiti, long before European ships appeared, courtship rituals were a mix of theater sport and small rebellions. A song might name a beloved only through metaphor, the breadfruit tree that leans toward my canoe. Everyone knew what it meant, but no one said it out loud. That silence wasn't repression, it was art. Marriage, though, was no simple pairing. It served alliances, and the heart often needed somewhere to breathe. Lovers who weren't spouses found loopholes guided by customs that balanced duty with pleasure. You can't call it cheating when the village knows and approves, when the very concept of ownership between lovers doesn't exist. In these islands, intimacy was shared like a canoe, borrowed, repaired, and respected. There were even specialists in navigating those emotional waters. In some societies, matchmakers or priestly advisors, often older women, would quietly guide young people toward or away from certain relationships. They didn't moralize, they optimized. You might be told that one brings laughter, but not children. Try the other cousin. It was pragmatic, not prudish. Curious how this worked in practice. Picture a young man on Rarotonga, newly tattooed, his skin still glistening with oil. His markings advertise his lineage, courage, and though he'd never admitted availability. Across the clearing, a woman hums a teasing chant that weaves his name with a word for coconut. It's a pun. Only the locals get half flirtation, half test. If he laughs, they talk. If he blushes, the elders chuckle. What fascinates you most is how none of this was considered shameful. The body wasn't a moral battlefield. It was a vessel of mana, spiritual energy. To be desirable was to be vital, to have the gods' attention. Even rituals of cleansing and anointing before a ceremony weren't about washing away guilt. They were about refreshing your power so it could be shared safely. Europeans, of course, misread everything. When Captain Cook's crew first saw women and men bathing together in lagoons, they gasped and wrote long paragraphs about native lewdness. But what they witnessed was hygiene, community, and casual comfort. To Polynesians, nakedness wasn't scandal. It was the default state of honesty. The real taboo wasn't exposure, it was deceit. And yet, the society wasn't chaos. There were still lines you didn't cross. Incest taboos, though complex, were enforced with terrifying precision. Royal families practiced controlled exceptions, believing divine blood needed to fold in on itself. But commoners risked banishment or even ritual punishment for breaking kinship boundaries. Love could be bold, but it couldn't be blind. You wonder how this system felt for everyday people. Did they ever tire of decoding signals and avoiding tapu landmines? Probably not. The island's social life thrived on nuance. A world where words could get you into trouble encouraged poetry. And if you think that sounds exhausting, compare it to the modern dating app. Swipe left, swipe right. Polynesians did it centuries earlier, but with flowers, songs, and moonlight instead of Wi-Fi. The ocean doesn't just separate islands, it connects bedrooms. If Section 1 was about unspoken rules, this one is about how those rules bent just enough to let curiosity breathe. You start to hear whispers of something unusual. Courtship rituals so open-minded, they'd make a Victorian faint and a modern therapist nod approvingly. In several Polynesian societies, romantic education began with what travelers later called trial beds. Young people, especially those nearing marriage age, were encouraged, even expected, to learn companionship firsthand. Forget the Western notion of purity locked behind curtains. Polynesians preferred practice with supervision. Families built small huts near the edge of the village, sometimes called love houses or sleeping houses, where couples could spend a night talking, cuddling, occasionally testing compatibility in the softest sense. In the morning, the pair might part smiling, or decide they weren't such a good match after all. The principle was balance, not indulgence. The community didn't cheer for promiscuity. It simply understood that good marriages required chemistry as much as genealogy. You can almost hear an elder explaining it. You wouldn't buy a canoe without checking if it floats. The humor lands gently, but makes the point. Of course, this wasn't universal. On some islands, especially those with strict, chiefly lines, courtship remained formal. But even there, young people found ways to test connection. In Tonga, girls gathered in communal dormitories, and boys would sing outside the windows after sunset. If a girl answered the song, it meant interest. If she remained silent, the serenade drifted into the sea. Sometimes, entire evenings became musical duels, love measured by who could rhyme better under a coconut tree. Tahiti Forever, the island that made European chroniclers blush, had perhaps the most elaborate system. Visitors in the 18th century noted the maidens of the sacred house, young women who hosted suitors as part of premarital festivals. The practice wasn't about exploitation. It was ritualized selection, with rules of courtesy and consent tightly woven. When Cook's crew recorded it, they mistook celebration for scandal. What they missed was that Polynesian women held remarkable agency. They chose, refused, negotiated. Desire here was not predation. It was dialogue. Imagine sitting in one of those houses. The night air hums with insects, pandanus, leaves creak overhead, and conversation slips between laughter and long pauses. Outside, you can hear elders chatting by the fire, not guarding, just present. It's intimacy with an audience of approval. An idea utterly alien to cultures that equated secrecy with virtue. Was jealousy a problem? Of course, it's part of being human. But jealousy was treated as a temporary illness, not a moral failing. Songs existed to soothe it. A common Tahitian verse went, "If the tide takes what I love, let the tide return another." You can almost feel the shrug in that line, a mix of acceptance and self-awareness. On islands where the population was small, flexibility mattered. Communities couldn't afford feuds over affection. Temporary pairings strengthened social cohesion, and children were often raised communally anyway. In some areas of the Marquesas, a child was considered of the house, not strictly of one father. The logic was simple: love feeds better when shared. You might pause here and think, isn't this just a utopia painted in moonlight? Not quite. It had rules sharper than coral. Seducing someone promised to another family could spark disputes. Consent wasn't a modern invention, it was baked into custom. A broken promise could mean social exile, a punishment far worse than any fine. Harmony was the true law, and those who disrupted it were quietly nudged to distant fishing posts until they learned their lesson. The surprising part is how public everything was without being shameful. Youth dances, songs, and late-night conversations were part of the social calendar. One pretended attraction didn't exist. They just staged it under the stars with style. You could call it the world's earliest open mic night for flirtation. Europeans raised on the myth of innocence were both scandalized and fascinated. Missionary journals describe youths permitted to consort before matrimony as though animals. But from the Polynesian view, the truly animal behavior was ignorance forcing people into unions without ever letting them meet. It's hard not to smile at the irony. The islanders were practicing compatibility testing centuries before modern psychology coined the term. There are modern echoes, too. In parts of Samoa today, cultural festivals still host Ava ceremonies, where young people meet through formal dialogue, less physical, more poetic, but carrying the same spirit of mutual choice. You could say the ancient sleeping houses evolved into community halls with microphones. Different furniture, same intention, let attraction find its manners. As the drums quiet and the fire sinks into embers, you realize this wasn't a free-for-all, it was education with a sense of humor. Polynesians taught intimacy the same way they taught navigation through experience, respect, and a clear awareness of tides. And when those lessons ended at dawn, another class of experts took the stage. The entertainers who turned passion into performance. By now you've learned that Polynesia didn't hide desire, it choreographed it. But on some islands, love itself was an occupation, an art that mixed music, movement, and philosophy. In Tahiti, pleasure was so sacred that a whole class of people made it their full-time job, the arioi performers. Priests and lovers whose lives burned bright and brief like torches at midnight. You picture them arriving by canoe feathers, glittering drums calling before their feet even touch sand. The villagers already know the sound. Children run to watch elders pretend not to grin. The arioi are here troop cult and carnival all in one body. They travel between islands, performing dances, farces, and chants that blur religion and sensuality. But their fame isn't just for entertainment. It's for the strange vow that shapes their lives. No children, no inheritance, only art. In a society where fertility was celebrated, this vow was shocking. Yet it wasn't self-hatred, it was strategy. By renouncing parenthood, the arioi devoted themselves entirely to joy, to hospitality, to ceremony. They lived for performance the way sailors live for wind. And within that vow, eroticism became ritual. European explorers wrote about them in half disbelief. Joseph Banks called them players in scenes of licentious merriment, but his prim English barely scratched the surface. What he saw as scandal was structured theater. The Arioi staged mythic tales, love between gods, infidelity among mortals, the comical fallout of jealousy. Dances alternated between slow, hypnotic grace and bursts of laughter. The body wasn't objectified. It was instrument. Members joined in pairs or trios, often same-sex, often changing over time. Rank determined costume tattoo patterns and which stories you could perform. The highest ranks called Arioi Maro. Ura Red Sash Arioi led the rituals that greeted visiting canoes and blessed festivals. During those ceremonies, flirtation wasn't a side effect. It was divine theater. Imagine the scene of full moon, a torchlit, clearing voices rising in rhythmic call and response. A woman dances with shoulders bare. Her partner, male or female, mirrors her movements perfectly. The crowd claps in time. The line between audience and performer dissolves. When the dance ends, no one asks, "Was that moral?" They ask, "Was it beautiful?" One French missionary, Père Morinhu, admitted grudgingly that the Arioi's influence was irresistible. Chiefs entertained them lavishly, knowing a visit from the troupe was both blessing and PR event. Even their critics couldn't deny that Arioi festivals unified the islands. They were a network of art and affection long before telegraphs. But life inside the Arioi had its costs. Their vow against raising children meant that pregnancies were taboo. Historical accounts filtered through missionary pens claim infanticide followed, though modern scholars suspect exaggeration by horrified outsiders. What's certain is that the group lived as if devotion to beauty demanded sacrifice. To keep joy sacred, they carried sorrow in silence. Why did Polynesian society tolerate, even revere them? Because the Arioi embodied the god's own paradox, pleasure mixed with restraint abundance, balanced by discipline. They reminded people that passion wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Every gesture, every song was a small rehearsal of cosmic order. There's something almost modern about them. Think of rock stars who live on tour, adored and criticized in equal measure, feeding audiences what ordinary life cannot provide. The Arioi did it centuries earlier, minus the electric guitars. Their stage was the beach. Their spotlight, the moon. In some ways, they anticipated the influencer economy, traveling, performing, living on gifts, crafting identity through spectacle. But unlike modern fame, theirs was communal. Each island hosted them, fed them, joined their plays. Fame returned warmth instead of envy. You wonder what it felt like to be inside that troupe, to wake to the sound of drums, to oil your skin with fragrant monoi, to rehearse a dance where laughter and temptation swap steps, to belong to a family built not by blood, but by rhythm. There must have been exhaustion, heartbreak, maybe envy, but also belonging, the kind only performers know when the crowd inhales as one. When missionaries arrived, the Arioi became public enemy number one. Their festivals were too popular, their joy too persuasive. Churches rose where stages once stood. Drums were silenced, dances banned. Yet, as you know by now, Polynesian culture never truly deletes anything. It just hides it in plain sight. Some Arioi adapted as professional entertainers for colonial banquets, turning the forbidden into paid skill. Others faded into legend, their memory absorbed into the broader fabric of Polynesian storytelling. Even today, echoes survive. In Tahiti's Heva festival, dancers perform routines that scholars trace directly to Arioi scripts. Same beats, same teasing humor, sanitized for modern tourists, but carrying ancient undertones. When performers step barefoot into that same sand, they're not reviving decadence, they're reviving identity. So when you next see a Polynesian dance and think it's just tradition, remember this: once upon a time, That very dance was a revolution, disguised as grace. The Arioi didn't just entertain. They proved that joy could be sacred and the body could preach without a single word. In Samoa, gender was never a straight line. It was a circle drawn in sand, redrawn by each tide. You find yourself in a courtyard smelling of coconut oil and roasted breadfruit, where laughter spills faster than gossip. The center of attention is neither the chief nor the missionary, but someone in between, a fa'afafine, graceful, witty, unbothered by the binary that foreign tongues later tried to import. Here, affection isn't rebellion, it's routine. The fa'afafine, literally in the manner of a woman, have existed in Samoan life for centuries. They cook, weave teas, lead choir rehearsals, and fix whatever the men break. Their charm lies not in imitation, but in balance. You watch one hand out garlands flirt with the drummer and negotiate the price of taro, all in one conversation. She or he, depending on who's speaking, runs the social current of the village as naturally as the tide runs the reef. Anthropologists once stumbled over how to categorize them. Third gender, they wrote in their notes, as if gender were a card deck missing a few suits. But Samoans never needed that language. A fa'afafine was family. Every village had at least one, sometimes several, each carrying specific roles, organizing events, caring for elders, raising siblings' children. They filled gaps left by rigid division of labor. Gender wasn't identity politics. It was logistics. What surprises outsiders most is how openly affection flows around them. During festivals, fa'afafine joke about crushes, compliment warriors, and perform dances that exaggerate both masculine strength and feminine grace. Nobody flinches. Children clap, elders chuckle. Only the occasional tourist blushes. You could say Samoa turned what other cultures call taboo into its social glue. There's a word you hear often, aiga family, but not just biological. It means collective belonging. A fa'afafine who brings joy, harmony, and humor increases the village's mana spiritual strength. Their charisma isn't merely tolerated, it's strategic. Need peace between quarreling cousins? Send a fa'afafine with a tray of food and a song. Missionaries, of course, tried to erase this fluidity. In the 19th century, they thundered about unnatural ways, but the sermons never quite stuck. The local response was simple smile nod and continue living. Even today, you can walk through Apia and see fa'afafine anchoring church choirs, hosting radio shows, managing NGOs. They survived by folding their identity into service, the most respected currency in Samoa. Do people fall in love with them constantly? Sometimes men, sometimes other fa'afafine. The relationships are complicated only from an outsider's view. Within the culture, affection finds its level like water. A fa'afafine might nurture a long-term bond with a man who later marries a woman. Yet the emotional connection endures, acknowledged, even joked about. The community rarely bothers with Western categories like fidelity or betrayal. The metric is contribution. Do you care for your kin? Honor obligations, keep the humor alive. Everything else is weather. There's a famous Samoan saying, "E leo se mea fu." This is nothing new. It's the standard response whenever foreign journalists arrive expect a scandal. They'll ask, "How do you explain the acceptance of fa'afafine?" and get that line followed by a laugh. It's not tolerance, it's familiarity. The same way you don't accept the rain, you just know when to bring an umbrella. In the evenings, you might see them perform the tawa luga, the closing dance of a celebration. The crowd forms a circle. Drums quicken. A fa'afa fiend steps forward, hips rolling with slow precision, fingers painting the air. The movements tell stories, birth, harvest, love, and occasionally a bit of cheeky flirtation with someone in the front row. It's both art and autobiography. When she finishes, elders shower her with money, children run forward with flowers, and someone yells a compliment that would scandalize any Victorian dinner table. What's interesting is how this fluid role extends beyond performance. The Fa'afa Fiend have their own organizations. Now the Samoa Fa'afa Fiend Association, founded in 2006, for instance. They advocate for health education and cultural pride, walking the fine line between tradition and global activism. Their visibility challenges both colonial residue and imported conservatism. And they do it with humor sharp enough to cut through any hypocrisy. A modern Samoan politician once tried to ban a beauty pageant run by Fa'afa Fiend. The event went ahead anyway, drawing larger crowds than his campaign. The following year, he showed up as a sponsor. That's the Polynesian way, conflict resolved with charm, not confrontation. If you ask a Fa'afa Fiend what love means, they might quote a proverb, "E le sili le tai I lo le tapuai." Guidance is better than force. It applies to romance, leadership, even survival. They understand that the secret to endurance isn't resistance, it's rhythm. As night settles over Samoa, you realize the laughter hasn't stopped. It swirls like smoke through palm leaves, mingling with the scent of hibiscus. You can't quite tell where admiration ends and affection begins, and maybe that's the point. In a world obsessed with definitions, Polynesians built one that breathes. The body speaks long before the mouth does. On these islands, skin is grammar and scent is punctuation. Polynesians didn't need perfume ads or dating apps. They could read each other like a map just by glancing at tattoos, oil, or the sheen of sweat under the sun. Your status, your story, even your desirability were written on your skin. You begin at dawn when the tattooist sets out his bone combs and soot. The air smells of coconut oil and burnt kukui nut. The client lies still, flanked by friends who sing to distract from the pain. Each tap drives pigment under flesh, but also meaning lines, marking genealogy, courage, and spiritual alignment. To be tattooed was to be visible in every sense: bravery, endurance, and yes, attractiveness. In Samoa, a fully tattooed man wearing only his IE Lava Lava wrap was considered ready for anything leadership ceremony love. The design wasn't decoration, it was a resume. Women, too, bore tattoos more delicate along thighs and hands. These marks weren't ornamental, so much as communicative. I belong to this family. I've endured this right. I carry this dignity. In Hawaii, female tattooing on the tongue or lips showed spiritual strength. In Tahiti, ink spiraled along hips to accentuate dance. There's humor in that art doubling as both credential and flirtation. But it wasn't only ink. Oil and fragrance told their own stories. Imagine an evening feast where everyone gleams, literally. Coconut oil mixed with crushed sandalwood and thai leaves turns the body into a lantern. It protects against salt air, but it also advertises vitality. Polynesian poetry often equated scent with divinity. To smell good was to be blessed. Missionaries predictably called this vanity. Locals called it hygiene. The difference, as usual, was moral tone. A chief entering a gathering might be recognized not just by attire, but by the specific blend of oils his household produced. The fragrance of tiare flowers in his hair meant high status. The sharper aroma of pandanus or ginger might hint at youth or mischief. It was the original cologne hierarchy centuries before Paris bottled it. You could say Polynesia invented signature scent culture before fashion houses did. Touch carried equal weight. Greetings often involved pressing noses and inhaling honi in Hawaii ha'a in other dialects. The gesture shared breath, literally exchanging spirit. Outsiders found it too intimate. Locals found handshakes bizarrely cold. To smell another person's skin was to confirm they were alive, well and truthful. Even now, some elders say you can't truly know someone till you've breathed the same air nose to nose. Adornment had practical messages too. Flower garlands or he weren't mere decoration. They signaled relationship status. A blossom behind the left ear meant taken, behind the right meant available, and behind both. It's complicated. Travelers still use that code in Tahiti, where the rule has survived Instagram. Polynesians were subtle long before emojis. These gestures, tattoo, oil garland, created a sensory language for desire that didn't require words. To the Western observer, it looked like decadence. But really, it was precision. Why stumble through awkward confessions when you could adjust a flower or layer a scent? Attraction here was as much about rhythm and smell as sight and sound. There's a story from the Cook Islands about a woman who fell in love with a man after catching his scent across a lagoon wind. She followed it to the beach and found him fishing. He noticed her tattoos first, the curved lines along her calf that told him she came from a respected lineage. They exchanged few words. The rest, communication older than speech. The story ends with laughter, not tragedy, because in Polynesia, good chemistry was cause for celebration, not suspicion. Europeans naturally missed the point. They described tattooing as self-mutilation and body oil as lustful display. The irony, sailors returning home proudly showed off their own Polynesian tattoos within months. You can almost hear a Tahitian chuckle across time. You call it sinful, then you copy it. Even now, Pacific Islanders reclaim tattooing as both heritage and resistance. The Tatau revival across Samoa and Tonga is part fashion, part faith, part remembrance. Each session retells family history through pain and pigment. Young people describe it as coming home through the skin. They know their ancestors once spoke through those same lines that whispered bravery, discipline, and maybe to a careful eye attraction. Modern culture may separate beauty, spirituality, and romance, but Polynesia never did. The body wasn't a battlefield of temptation. It was a manuscript of meaning. Every mark, every scent, every brush of fingers said something specific, sometimes sacred, sometimes teasing, always intentional. So when you see a dancer's skin glisten under torchlight, or catch the fragrance of tiare drifting through a humid night, understand that you're witnessing a conversation older than writing, older than guilt, a dialogue between body, earth, and ocean. Polynesians just happened to keep the grammar intact while the rest of the world forgot. You've seen the flirtations, the oils, the tattoos that talk louder than words. But now you wade into the deeper waters of alliance, where love isn't just personal, it's political. In Polynesia, marriage wasn't about two hearts finding each other. It was about two bloodlines deciding who got to share coconuts and power. Unlike Western fairy tales, these unions weren't built on happily ever after. They were built on logistics, diplomacy, and a bit of creative mathematics. In some regions, a chief could have multiple wives, not because of unchecked appetite, but because each one represented a treaty. A wife from a neighboring island meant safe harbors. A wife from a rival clan meant the next generation carried both banners. The Polynesians didn't need contracts, they used weddings instead of wars. Polygyny, having more than one wife, was common among high-ranking men. But here's the twist, those wives often held their own power. The first wife usually controlled household rituals. The second might manage trade or artisans. A third perhaps governed younger siblings or servants. These weren't silent partners, they were ministers in a domestic cabinet. If jealousy appeared, it was handled diplomatically. A neglected wife could return to her family taking gifts and her dignity with her. You'd lose her affection, but also her clan's support. Balance was everything. And what about the women? They weren't exactly waiting on the sidelines. In parts of the Marquesas and Tuamotus, polyandry, one woman with multiple husbands also existed, especially in remote islands where men voyaged for months. It wasn't scandal. It was survival. If one husband was away fishing, another protected the household. Children were raised communally, and paternity mattered less than harmony. You might picture it as chaos, but it functioned like a well-tuned canoe crew. Each paddler knowing their rhythm, aware that fighting mid-voyage meant sinking. Imagine modern marriage counselors watching in disbelief as 14th century islanders practiced what they now call open communication. Sibling exchange was another elegant, if eyebrow-raising tradition. Two families might swap brothers and sisters in mutual marriage arrangements, ensuring equity and trust. You take mine, I take yours wasn't cynicism. It was strategy. The emotional calculus assumed that mutual vulnerability bred cooperation. To betray your spouse was to endanger your sibling's happiness. No law required fidelity. Social gravity did. Some of these customs were enshrined in myth. In Hawaiian genealogies, divine siblings like Pele and Hiaka represented opposing yet intertwined forces: fire and fertility, destruction and renewal. Human kin mirrored divine order relationships built to echo cosmic balance. Love, duty, and divinity were threads of the same mat. Missionaries predictably called it moral confusion. But Polynesians might have countered, you can't confuse what's already in harmony. Marriage systems flexed to match geography and survival needs. On islands with limited resources, sharing partners reduced conflict and spread parenting labor. On larger islands where wealth concentrated, marriage built alliances across valleys. Flexibility wasn't moral decay, it was social intelligence. Still, these arrangements had emotional texture. Love songs mourned absent spouses, teased rivals, celebrated shared affection. One Tahitian chant survives, describing a woman with two husbands, one a warrior, the other a fisherman. One feeds my hunger, one stills my fear. It's a simple line, but devastatingly human. Beneath the practical framework, feelings still pulsed. There's a story from Rarotonga about a chief who loved two sisters equally. To avoid favoritism, he divided his time by moon phases, waxing for one, waning for the other. When Europeans heard it, they wrote moral essays. The locals just admired his time management. These systems also created safety nets for widows and orphans. If a husband died, his brother often stepped in, not out of lust, but duty. The term levirate marriage sounds clinical now, but for Polynesians, it ensured no woman or child faced isolation. Community was insurance, and intimacy was part of the policy. You might ask, was there heartbreak? Absolutely. Jealousy didn't vanish under palm leaves. Songs tell of secret affairs, of stolen nights, of lovers eloping across lagoons. But instead of lawsuits, most disputes ended with humor compensation or clever poetry. He took my wife but returned my canoe. One proverb quips, so the gods will judge us even. It's easy to mistake this system for permissiveness. In reality, it was duty wearing a smile. The island's moral compass pointed not to chastity, but to balance. Harmony in households meant harmony in harvests. Chiefs who abused power by hoarding partners or breaking promises risked divine wrath, usually in the form of famine or rebellion. What's striking is how egalitarian the emotional landscape was even within hierarchy. Love wasn't confined to one model. It adapted to tides, population, and circumstance. And while European colonizers tried to box desire into marriage certificates, Polynesians preferred their love flexible, renewable, and interwoven with daily life. So the next time someone complains that modern relationships are complicated, tell them they're just catching up with Polynesian diplomacy. 1,000 years ago, islanders already understood what modern couples are still learning, that sharing power is the hardest and most intimate art of all. In Polynesia, breaking a taboo could feel more scandalous than breaking a heart. You sit by a smoky cooking pit as elders explain that desire was never just about beds, it was about boundaries. Eating together, touching food, or even sitting in the wrong place could signal intimacy louder than any confession. The word tapu, sacred restriction, didn't only protect temples, it also guarded bodies. Who could eat with whom, who could share a dish, or whose leftovers you could taste was all choreographed by invisible law. The logic was cosmic. Every act carried spiritual current. Share food wrongly, and you didn't just insult the family, you disrupted the gods. Yet like all powerful rules, the temptation to bend them was irresistible. On most islands, men and women ate separately, especially among the nobility. Women prepared food but couldn't touch sacred vessels or consume certain delicacies like pork or shark foods charged with mana, spiritual energy reserved for men and chiefs. To sneak a bite of those forbidden dishes with a lover wasn't gluttony, it was intimacy. Imagine a couple sharing roasted pork in secret, aware that every mouthful is both pleasure and rebellion. It's less a meal, more a love letter written in smoke. In Hawaii, these rules were formalized under the Ai Kapu system. Men and women couldn't eat together at all. The separation reinforced cosmic balance between male and female deities. But history, like hunger, is stubborn. In 1819, a few years before Christian missionaries arrived, Queen Ka'ahumanu and King Liholiho publicly broke the rule, sitting down together to eat. That single meal, called the Ainoa free eating, abolished centuries of dietary taboo overnight. It was both a political coup and an erotic gesture disguised as dinner. In Polynesia, liberation began with shared food. Elsewhere, the link between sustenance and seduction stayed subtler. On Tahiti, feeding someone by hand was a recognized act of courtship. To accept food from another's fingers implied trust deeper than words. It's easy to see why missionaries panicked. They'd never imagined a culture where the most intimate thing wasn't kissing, but sharing a taro bite. Even outside the royal circles, small rebellions thrived. Fishermen brought the first catch to sweethearts instead of priests. Women brewed kava for forbidden companions. Lovers met at the edge of feasts to exchange morsels before joining their proper seats. In every gesture, the message was clear. I'm breaking the universe a little for you. The body itself could become tapu. During menstruation, childbirth, or mourning, individuals carried heightened spiritual charge. Touching them, or being touched, was restricted. But some stories twist that tension into tenderness. On Rapa Nui, a man once sat beside his grieving lover, despite her mourning taboo, whispering that love should share sorrow as well as joy. The legend says the gods rewarded him with fertile land. Break a rule for empathy, and even divinity relented. Not all taboos were gentle. Violating sacred spaces or rank boundaries could mean exile or death. But many minor breaches were handled with ritual cleansing rather than punishment. Wash in salt water, offer a chant, restore balance. The point wasn't guilt, it was equilibrium. Unlike later Christian codes, Polynesian taboos didn't moralize desire. They managed energy. You can almost imagine a modern parallel office romances, governed by unwritten etiquette dinner parties where seating charts imply more than words. Every culture invents rules to contain attraction. Polynesia simply admitted that those rules were part of the thrill. Sometimes tapu even protected affection. Couples of different rank who couldn't marry publicly maintained their bonds through coded rituals, exchanging food across barriers, meeting at sacred groves where no one else dared tread. Their secrecy wasn't shame. It was safety wrapped in ceremony. Love survived not by defiance, but by fluency in the language of taboo. When missionaries arrived, they mistook this complexity for chaos. To them, every restriction looked like oppression and every breach like sin. But Polynesians understood better. They knew that rules give shape to freedom, just as the reef gives shape to waves. A world without taboos would be unmoored. A world without exceptions would be lifeless. There's an old proverb from Tonga. Ai uluaki kai, oku ikai ke mau hono osi. Who eats first never tastes the end. It warns against greed, but it also nods at timing, the secret art behind both feasts and love affairs. Knowing when to wait and when to risk breaking the rule made the difference between scandal and legend. So when you watch a Polynesian feast today, with everyone laughing around the fire, know that it isn't just dinner. It's the memory of centuries of negotiation between hunger and holiness, between manners and mischief. Every shared plate still carries that quiet echo. Breaking bread once meant breaking boundaries, and sometimes that's exactly what made it taste divine. By now you've learned that Polynesian desire wasn't chaotic. It was carefully tuned like a drum line, playing between taboo and temptation. But some passions needed extra help, and that's where the island's secret pharmacy came in. Forget modern dating advice. Polynesians were brewing love potions centuries before rom-coms and roses existed. You walk through a dusky garden on Tahiti, where the air feels almost alive. Fragrance drifts from every direction: jasmine, ylang-ylang, crushed Thai leaves, and something sweetly spiced. Every plant here has a second name, whispered only to those who know. Ordinary flowers by day, aphrodisiacs by night. In these societies, attraction wasn't left entirely to fate. Islanders believed mana, the vital force, could be stirred, focused, or even transferred through plants, oils, and chants. You might think of it as chemistry, just without the lab coats. In Samoa, women mixed coconut oil with the petals of moso'oi blossoms to make perfume called sua. A drop on the wrist, a dab behind the ear, and supposedly conversation bloomed like a tide. Men had their own methods. Fishermen returning from long voyages carried charms made of braided pandanus, sometimes perfumed with crushed ginger or noni leaves, said to reignite affection after separation. Whether it worked or not, the scent announced confidence, which is half of any spell. Love magic here wasn't dark, it was playful. People sought to attract, not to dominate. Old healers known as taura or kahuna lapa'au blended herbs with prayer, asking gods like Lono or Tane for favor in romance. The ingredients read like poetry: pounded banana heart for sweetness, coral dust for endurance, ocean water for memory. Each recipe mixed the senses: taste, touch, smell, and sound. You didn't just wear the potion, you sang to it. A chant from the Marquesas survives. May the breeze carry my name to the ear that waits. Simple, sly, and utterly human. These were societies that understood seduction as communication. You didn't force attention, you invited it to arrive on the wind. And then there was kava. Across Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa, the root of the Piper methysticum plant was ground-soaked and strained into an earthy, numbing drink. Officially, kava soothed nerves and strengthened community ties. Unofficially, it loosened tongues and quieted shyness. A shared bowl under torchlight could melt hesitation faster than poetry. Chiefs used it to bless alliances, lovers used it to confess feelings, and everyone agreed it helped people say what they meant. Think of it as Polynesia's answer to first-date jitters, ancient, herbal, and communal. Other potions were riskier. In some tales, jealous lovers consulted sorcerers for charms that could bind affection or repel rivals. These charms involved hair strands carved to shells, or knots tied in secret. The consequences, however, were unpredictable. Elders warned that manipulating mana too directly could backfire. Your desire might consume you instead. There's an old saying from Rarotonga: love forced is like fire under sand. It burns unseen but scorches the feet. The use of scent, texture, and ritual in courtship also had a moral side. These preparations reminded people that attraction wasn't separate from respect. To make perfume was to prepare your self-wash. Reflect, purify, intention. The ritual itself created mindfulness. Westerners saw only the result: shiny skin and heady fragrance. But Polynesians saw the invisible layer of effort and care, which might explain why love often lasted longer than European diaries suggested. Even food had its alchemy. Breadfruit roasted with honey and coconut milk was considered a gentle stimulant. Sea cucumber broth, high in minerals, had a similar reputation. And then there were less scientific remedies, like bathing in water, where lovers once swam, or sleeping with a garland from a shared festival night. Some ingredients were tangible, others symbolic. All were attempts to align body and spirit toward one purpose: connection. When Christianity spread through the islands, these practices were the first to be labeled witchcraft. Missionaries banned love charms along with drums, fearing anything that stirred emotion might stir rebellion. Yet even they couldn't erase the allure of fragrance. Churchgoers arrived wearing flower crowns and scented oils, quietly turning Sunday service into an olfactory protest. You can ban a chant, but you can't stop someone from smelling amazing. Centuries later, echoes linger. Tourists still buy monoi oil in Tahiti, unaware it descends from ancient formulas of attraction. The global perfume industry borrows Polynesian notes, tiare, vanilla, frangipani, but strips away their context. What was once sacred chemistry becomes tropical holiday in a bottle. But the roots remain deeper than marketing. You can almost see it: a lover standing by the surf at dusk, garland in hand, murmuring a charm into the wind. No flash, no candles. Just a belief that words, plants, and breath can bend fate slightly toward affection. Maybe that's not so strange. Humans everywhere do the same thing now, only we call it manifesting. So as the night thickens, the garden glows faintly with oil lamps. The air is heavy with perfume and anticipation, proof that desire has always been part ritual, part risk, part hope. And in Polynesia, hope always smelled like flowers after rain. If love charms whispered in the dark, Polynesian dances shouted them beneath the stars. When drums began to thunder, words became useless, because on these islands, bodies told the truth better than any confession ever could. You're standing at the edge of a festival night, the sand still warm from the day, the air shimmering with torch smoke. Every few beats, a drum drops deep enough to rattle your ribs. In the center of the clearing, dancers move in hypnotic precision, hips like ocean waves, hands, painting invisible stories in the air. What you're watching isn't just entertainment. It's the social network of an ancient world. Every sway, every glance, a coded message between villages, lovers, and rivals. Long before TikTok choreographies, Polynesians used movement to communicate everything from welcome to seduction. The Tahitian otea showcased rapid hip-shaking and synchronized lines, originally performed by men, but later joined by women. The Samoan siva, gentler, but no less potent, celebrated grace and storytelling. Each dance told a history, yet between the history lines were smaller, riskier stories, flirtation teasing rivalry. The stage was an arena of unspoken dialogue, where affection was both art and competition. In these gatherings, boundaries softened. Nightfall meant permission. Chiefs sat in honored circles while younger performers tested limits with playful mimicry. Some routines began solemnly invoking gods, then slipped into comic or romantic improvisations. Dancers might lock eyes across the fire, inviting interpretation without consequence unless the audience caught on and roared approval. Think of it as ancient reality TV, but with better lighting and fewer regrets. The body language was bold, yet coded. A dancer's foot placement, wrist flick, or smile could hint at marital status or desire. To raise one's chin in rhythm might suggest, "I see you." To roll the hips faster than the drum allowed might translate to, "I dare you." No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. Elders chuckled knowingly, children giggled. Polynesian humor ran on double meanings, and dances were its prime vocabulary. Missionaries predictably had a meltdown. To them, bare skin plus rhythmic motion equaled sin. They banned traditional performances wherever they could, replacing them with hymns and modest pageants. Yet, even under colonial watch, the dances persisted, slowed down, disguised as cultural exhibitions or moved indoors. Over time, the forbidden became folklore, and folklore eventually returned to the open air. Today's tourist shows, though sanitized, still pulse with the same ancestral rhythm that once turned flirtation into diplomacy. The irony is that many of these dances were less about lust than respect. Movements mirrored natural phenomena. The sway of palm trees, the roll of tides, the flight of birds. When dancers embodied those forms, they honored creation itself. To move beautifully was to thank the gods. Desire wasn't opposite to spirituality. It was its echo. The audience knew this. They didn't see seduction. They saw balance, the human body syncing with the island's heartbeat. Still, no one can deny that the performances carried emotional voltage. The best dancers became local celebrities, courted by admirers bearing garlands or bowls of kava. Some used dance as matchmaking, a chance to catch a prospective partner's eye under socially acceptable pretext. If you were shy, rhythm did the talking. If you were bold, rhythm gave you an excuse. There's a beloved story from Tahiti about two rival dancers, a man and a woman, who competed in every festival. Each year, they tried to outshine the other, inventing new moves, sharper spins, quicker steps. One night, in the middle of a duel, their timing aligned perfectly. The crowd fell silent. They finished the dance face to face, breathing hard, then bowed. The next morning, they announced their marriage. The legend ends with the line, "They danced until they couldn't tell who led." Even today, dance remains Polynesia's most enduring conversation about love. The hula in Hawaii, once nearly banned, has become a vehicle for cultural revival. Teachers emphasize that it's not about performance, but storytelling, each gesture a word, each word a prayer. When a dancer opens her hands to the sky, she's offering the story to the gods, not just to the audience. In that act, desire becomes gratitude, and art becomes continuity. You can't help but notice how democratic it feels. In a single evening, the entire community participates, elders drumming children, singing teens dancing. No stage divides performer from viewer. Everyone shares the same pulse. The line between ritual and recreation blurs, proving again that Polynesians didn't separate the sacred from the sensual. Both belong to life's same ocean. The night thickens, drums slow, and the crowd disperses. Ash drifts through the air like lazy confetti. Couples linger pretending to help clean up while actually whispering in the shadows. You smell oil, sweat, and salt of perfume the world has never been able to replicate. Maybe that's why every traveler who witnesses these nights leaves haunted not by scandal, but by envy. They've seen what it means for a society to dance with its own humanity unashamed. And as the last drumbeat fades, the same question lingers that has floated across these islands for centuries. If a dance can speak all that words can't, then why did outsiders ever try to silence it? When the missionaries finally arrived with their Bibles and waistcoats, they didn't just try to change Polynesian faith. They tried to rewrite desire itself. You can almost hear the first Sunday bells echo through the valleys of Tahiti and Samoa, ringing louder than the drums they replaced. Men wore cloth that chafed women draped in cotton too thick for the sun, and suddenly the word sin appeared in a language that had never needed it. The islands, once alive with open laughter and rhythmic flirtation, now faced a new kind of storm, the collision between inherited joy and imported shame. Missionaries saw paradise as something to be purified. They outlawed dances, declared tattoos heathen marks, and rebranded ancient love songs as temptations of the devil. But how do you shame a culture that never thought its body was dirty? That was the puzzle. The first wave of converts obeyed publicly, but carried the old rhythm privately. Church choirs hummed for melodies under hymns. Perfumed oils reappeared for the skin's health, not for seduction. Polynesians learned to survive the new morality the same way they survived hurricanes, by bending, never breaking. Some chiefs, sensing colonial power shifts, sided with missionaries for political advantage. Others resisted quietly. In Hawaii, Queen Ka'ahumanu, once a revolutionary, who broke the Aikapu food taboo, ironically became a fierce enforcer of Christian law. Dancing was banned, love rituals erased. Yet even she couldn't uproot instinct. Islanders found ways to slip rebellion into respectability. The hula repackaged as cultural heritage resurfaced in schools. Flirtation reappeared as hospitality. Old gestures lived on in winks and flower placements. In Samoa, fa'afafine adapted with trademark humor. When preachers scolded them for unnatural ways, they replied, "Then God must have loved variety. He made so much of it." Their resilience outlasted condemnation. Instead of vanishing, they became community leaders, organizing charity events for the same churches that once rejected them. The missionaries brought rules. The fa'afafine brought laughter. Guess who the people listened to across the Pacific? Colonial laws criminalized behaviors once considered sacred. Homosexual acts, public affection, even certain dances became punishable offenses. But culture, like tide, finds new paths. Storytellers turned the forbidden into metaphor. A fisherman casting two nets meant a man with two loves. A hidden reef meant desire society pretended not to see. Poetry kept history breathing beneath the surface. By the late 19th century, the contradictions were everywhere. Islanders attended mass by day and held moonlit dances by night. Sailors who arrived expecting moral order instead have found villages that smiled politely, nodded to the Bible, and continued loving as they always had. One British chaplain despaired in his journal. They sing hymns with sincerity, yet laugh in a manner wholly immodest. Translation: joy was winning. Modern Polynesia still lives with the inheritance of that struggle. Colonial morality left its fingerprints on law codes and family expectations, but the islands never lost their elasticity. Each generation finds new ways to reconcile ancestry with faith, sensuality, with spirituality. The love songs return the tattoos, return the dances, return stronger each time. You can't suppress an ocean by drawing a fence. Even global tourism played an ironic role in revival. What missionaries once condemned as indecent became the very thing the world paid to see. The Tahitian otea and Hawaiian hula now headline festivals blending heritage with showmanship. Some locals grumble about commercialization. Others see it as poetic justice. What was once shamed for being too human now earns applause for being authentically Polynesian. You think back to the first sections, the garlands, the oils, the trial beds, and realize they never disappeared. They adapted, camouflaged beneath layers of imported decorum. The forbidden survived in gestures, a shared bowl of kava, a song with double meanings, a dance too graceful to be entirely innocent. The missionaries brought guilt, but guilt never learned the local language. There's a proverb whispered across islands from Tonga to Tahiti. The wave bows to no master. It sums up everything. Foreign laws came and went, but the rhythm